I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 8, Episode 3, and frickin' Take 3 of Music is Not a Genre, MxG. I do these hand gestures as entertainment for you, and also to drive home the fact that MxG, which is the logo, means music. MX is not G, genre. And no matter how many times I do it, I have no idea whether you're doing it right or wrong. You have to give me some feedback and let me know if you need help with that. It's a very important life thing. This week's topic is Sweet Dreams of the New Romantic Wave, book talk number 9. But before we get to that, thank you as always for watching and listening. Listeners, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre. You get a video for every episode of this podcast. Watchers, go to nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre. If you would rather not see that I am wearing a Wombats shirt, and I will tell you why later. And everyone, go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre to support this podcast, my band Rec, and everything I do. One of those things I do is I offer a song coaching service. If you go to nickdimatteo.com/song coaching, you can learn all about it. I'm getting ready to record a new intro video for that very soon, which by the time this airs, you may actually be ready. Hopefully it will be. We'll see. And basically what it is I can help you write the song that you've been sitting on for years and you just can't get to it for one reason or another. I know how to get you there, and I know how to finish the song and make it the best it can possibly be. Can even record it for you if you want to go that far. nickdimatteo.com/song coaching. And of course, my band Rec's new single, You Know You're Right, is out there streaming everywhere. Go to nickdimatteo.com/music. And you get all the streaming sites and social and even a page where my live gigs are and all of that stuff. And please give a listen to You Know You're Right. And no matter what you're listening to, whether it's this podcast or Rex Music, like, share, subscribe, rate, review, playlist, all the things that you're told to do actually do help. We got to beat that algorithm, and you can help me do that. So let's get to this topic. Again, it is Sweet Dreams of the New Romantic Wave, book talk number 9, and I called it that, of course, because it is based on the book Sweet Dreams, The Story of the New Romantics by Dylan Jones, which I will get into very shortly. And here's a little story of why I'm doing this book as a topic. First of all, I haven't done a book in a while. Last one I did, I think, was my friend Pete Bradis's book on the police, and needed to do that. And part of the reason I haven't done a book in a while is because I've been reading this book for months. It is a dense book. Very entertaining, very informative. There's a lot of anecdotes and all that stuff in there, but I wanted to take my time with it and really absorb it, because it turns out there's a ton that I didn't know about the period it covers, which is 1975, 1985 in British music. And what I noticed when I was reading is that, let's say you have New Romantic, and I call this, the reason I call it the New Romantic Wave is because in America, New Wave music, we know, if you know New Wave music, it's that kind of 80s mix of rock and electronic and disco and all that stuff. In Britain, it was called New Romantic, or Blitz apparently was another name for the people. Anyway, Blitz kids. And so that was that dichotomy, the fact that New Romantic is what it's called in Britain and New Wave in the U.S. And I did that partly because one huge thing I learned in this book is that I don't know a whole lot about the British scene. That what we think we know about music scenes in other countries, we really don't know. We only get trickles of what comes over here, and we interpret it based on our own experience. This book helps disabuse us of that when it comes to this era. Okay, so show format, I'm going to do a word on the title and the author, and then I'm going to follow the structure of the book from the preface all the way to the appendices and beyond. I'm going to blend facts from the book, direct quotes from the book, and my own observations from the book. And then some conclusions at the end of all of that, and the featured song, of course, and questions, as always. And don't forget the bonus MXtra. Patreon.com/musicisnotagenre is on the mega famous, hugely successful Stars of Music Spandau Ballet. And you will understand if you go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre and watch this bonus MXtra why I said they were mega famous and huge, because turns out they were. Sources, the book. That would be the main source. Google, flesh out certain gaps in my knowledge not directly covered by the book, although most of it is covered by the book, but not all. Streaming services to listen to songs that were mentioned in the book so I could get context and just kind of, for my own curiosity and to get into the music they were talking about. Some disclaimers. You're going to hear my spin, of course. Also, since I'm not from the UK, there will be people and subjects this book covers that I don't know, that I know little to nothing about, at least. I may have heard of some of them or whatever, and some I didn't. I never knew their names. So, discovery, right? So let's get right into the meat. Title and author. Dylan Jones has been a writer since at least the early 1980s. He was the editor of the UK version of GQ. That's a lot of initials. 1999 to 2021. So a long time. And is now the editor-in-chief of the London Standard, formerly the Evening Standard, and formerly before that, The Standard. It's a regional tabloid weekly. Also was an editor of ID and Arena, which will factor into this book, and I will mention at least one of those magazines. The double meaning there in terms of the title, Sweet Dreams, the story of the New Romantics, meaning it refers to the halcyon days of 1975 to 85 in the music world in Britain, or at least part of that was halcyon, maybe the mid part of it. And of course, it also refers to the song by the Eurythmics, Sweet Dreams, which is a great reference considering the topic of this book, because they were one of the products of this period's development. So the preface of the book is a nice vignette that sets the mood, sets the place. The introduction starts at 1975, but quickly explains how 1945 to 65 was a period of growth and morphing, and we'll get into a little bit of what that means in Britain in particular. And by 1975, there was stasis and decline, especially in the political, social, and economic culture of the UK, but also in the music world. That is the younger generation's disdain of overblown rock or easy listening rock. It's the thing you probably know, which is punk and hip hop and disco came out of the idea that rock and the popular market in terms of the radio kind of got a little too staid, a little too full of itself. And people came about to kind of, put some chinks in the armor and kind of break everything up and start fresh. Then there's a quick description of new romantic music as punk because there's disaffection involved, but also modeled on Bay City Rollers and glam mixed with dance, disco, and electro. And yes, it's weird to mention all of those kinds of music in one description, but as we go through the development, and one of the great things this book does is it's very step-by-step in terms of the development of this music, and you really get a sense of how it all came together, and you get a feel for the period. You'll understand why all of those types of music were mentioned when I'm describing new romantic or new wave. And from now on, unless there's a specific reason, I am going to say new romantic instead of new wave, but just know that they are the same thing. So the intro... the intro section, the introduction, the stasis and decline inspired a creative surge from 1975 to 85 that would change everything after, in fashion, in music, in sexuality, and its outward expression. The new romantic movement was patterned around boundless self-expression, especially gender fluidity, something that was not part of mainstream society then, as it mostly is now, though, of course, that can be disputed among certain factions in this country and around the world. But it's certainly more present than it was 40 years ago, and has always been present to one degree and another in society ever since society began. So this is a comment I have on this introduction. I can look back more fondly on the 80s because I don't have to live in it anymore. And I think part of that idea, and I may do an episode later this season on nostalgia and its downside, essentially. Yeah, it's upside too, but really kind of lay into the downside of nostalgia and how that kind of saps away our ability to be in the moment and enjoy what's going on now instead of glorifying what happened in the past. And here's an example. What started in the late 70s as an embrace of fashion as part of music, culture, and expression, an outward expression, eventually curdled into fashion over substance with the pressure to pick a lane, pick a side, pick a peer group, pick a genre. That was constant pressure, and there may be that pressure in parts of the world now, but based on what I've heard from my kids and etc., there is the way that the Breakfast Club, let's say, illustrated how there were the jocks and the geeks and whatever. There's still some of that, and I'm sure in some ways it's more than others. But in terms of music in particular, you don't have to pick a lane the way you used to. And so it became overwhelming. It became ultimately annoying. It became like, oh, why can't I like rock and disco or what have you? And that's exactly what was happening in Britain with this new romantic music with them saying, why can't I like both? You can see and hear how the culture pushed music forward more quickly than any previous decade. Everyone was jumping in and changing things, and thus the explosion of crossover genres and subgenres. So a quote from Dylan Jones: "It was a decade of cultural deregulation. And as much as it was a decade of financial deregulation. Not that they need to go hand in hand, they don't. But it just so happened that the culture itself was being deregulated from the bottom up, in terms of people expressing themselves more, et cetera, and the culture was being financially deregulated from the top down. So that was really the beginning of all of the kind of deregulation that's happened in Britain and in the U.S. and the rest of the world. The Pet Shop Boys' 1986 song, Paninaro, describes this era, this chicken and egg influence of culture on music and music on culture. The word paninaro was an early 1980s Italian youth subculture from Milan focused on fashion, American culture, and a carefree consumerist lifestyle. So kind of, expressionist bougie, you might say. The 80s proved that style and substance could coexist. Prior to that, artists tended to fall on one side or the other of that. You were either high fashion and the kind of soulless pop, or you were substance and you couldn't express yourself in fashion, except for people like Bowie, and we will get to Bowie. Or people were pigeonholed or stereotyped that way, even though they acted differently, and they were judged based on their side's standards. So if you were a rock band that all of a sudden started to dress up in a certain way, you were judged based on being a rock band. And if you were a pop band who wanted to dress down, let's say, you would be judged as a pop band. That was being broken apart during this period. Anomalies like Bowie were both the exception to the rule and canaries in the coal mine. People who were precursors and vanguards that both predicted what would come and gave everyone else the idea that they could do it too, which is one of the great things that great artists do, is that they give us the opportunity, the ability to say, oh, wow, I didn't know you could do that. Okay, I'm going to do that. So, first chapter, 1975, Fed Up with Fandango. Bowie and Roxy Music were immediately cited as the hugest influences on the overall package and approach of the New Romantics. I will admit some initial disappointment with this book in that I didn't realize, because I didn't really read up on it other than a review that I loved, and I was like, I need to get it eventually, and I did, and I read it, that it is largely a first-person account. So quotes and anecdotes from the people who lived through this. And even though I have enjoyed books like that, such as the one on SNL, the one on The Daily Show, I was so enjoying the author's style himself that I wanted more of that, which I guess I could just read more of Dylan Jones's books, and I might. It's important to remember that this book was written by a Brit about British people and culture, and even though much of it would bleed over into America, the first several years of development were largely separate. There were things happening in both countries that didn't much cross over. They were maybe inspiring each other, but not crossing over. And though both Britain and America were both dealing with country issues, financial crises, Britain's economy at that particular time was quite a bit worse. It really still hadn't fully recovered from World War II 30 years later. Who was popular in both countries was not always similar. Again, bonus M extra, patreon.com/music is not a genre. You will have no idea, I had no clue, how popular and successful Spandau Ballet were in the UK, considering they only had one big hit here. So check that out. When people were popular was almost always different. So there were artists who peaked in the mid to late 70s in Britain that were more popular here in the 80s and vice versa, that kind of a thing. Or there was a delay in one way or another. Case in point, the beginning of this chapter talks about Bowie and Brian Ferry or Roxy Music, his band, being huge and friendly rivals. That was not a thing in America. You know, people knew of Roxy Music. People knew Bowie quite a bit. But I don't think anybody in this country thought of them as rivals. That's just not something we experienced. There's lots of talk of fashion and haircuts, and that continues throughout the book. It sets a theme. Soul music from America was permeating British music, which is a key point of development for new romantic music. There's a quote here from the author again. Roxy Music were the first postmodern pop group. Self-referential, I guess you could say, meta. Retro future, 50s meets space, 50s meets the future, retro future. Was their album Siren the first album of the 80s? That's something that the book says. I had 3 reactions to this album. Number 1, no. It sounds very much of its time. But number 2, you can hear how it influenced the artists who would shape the early 80s sound. And number 3, it fully confirmed that I'm not a fan of Roxy Music. Respect them. Not a huge fan. Like the generation of musicians who were real-time influenced by the Beatles in the 60s, the next generation was real-time influenced by Bowie and Roxy Music. And this is the generation we're talking about in this book. And like the Beatles, different musicians and movements took different parts. So you could break down the Beatles into things like power pop, psychedelic music, straight-up rock, chamber pop, art pop. And in this case, from Bowie and from Brian Ferry, from Roxy Music, that generation created things like punk and new romantic and electro and all of that stuff. They took different parts and kind of extrapolated them. The obsession with fashion wasn't aligned with the culture at large, partly because nobody had money to have fashion, but also because most people didn't care. They were busy living lives and working. Didn't really click beyond the cult of new romantics and punks until the early 1980s. So it took several years for it to infiltrate the culture at large, and that's kind of what made the 1980s the 1980s, in a lot of ways. Interesting that Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood, though partners in the clothing store / hub of the future, Sex, the name of the store, Sex, had different ideas about what punk stood for. Both believed it was rebellion, but McLaren was more inclined to embrace failure and boredom and decay, which you can hear in everything he does, while Vivienne believed that rebellion was meant to wake up the world and change it for the better. It's no surprise that McLaren came from a rich family and ended up being conservative, and she didn't. Kraftwerk debuted on British TV in 1975. As anyone can tell you, they were a sea change for so many music people. Like Can and Neu, etc., krautrock was a huge influence on new romantic music. One of the guys in the band said it's more accurate to call their music electropop. Boom! Yes, I love that phrase, and I've used it before. I've called rec electro power pop. My note, maybe British music fans would readily know all the people speaking in this book. It would have been helpful if the author had put the bands they were in instead of just musician or what have it, like Andy McCluskey and Paul Humphreys were orchestral maneuvers in the dark, OMD. Had no idea. There is a section end of the book that helps, but it would have been cool to either say, check that section, or put it at the beginning. But I'll talk about it more at the end of the book. Bouncing back and forth, the book between punk and electronic is effective because it sets the mind up for the fact that punk and electronic blended to form new romantic. There were other influences, but those are the two main ones. Which brings me to the next chapter, 1976, Fireworks. The punk that started in 1975 spread like wildfire in 1976 and then by 1977 was dead. In the UK, not so in America. Like every movement ever, punk was fairly quickly co-opted by posers, people who were into it for the fashion and attitude more than the music. In some ways, the new romantic movement was more authentic than punk, though the true punk aesthetic, DIY, oh, I should have worn that shirt. Oh, well. Anti-establishment, misfits, weirdos, sexually fluid people, etc., would live on in post-punk and alternative and even future waves of punk itself. Other than in New Romantic. Like so many genres, including disco and grunge, punk started out more gender fluid and then gradually got co-opted by straighter, less inclusive people. I think one reason New Romantic appealed to me, or New Wave, as I knew it, was that it seemed to combine the masculine and the feminine and types of music that previously didn't seem to be combinable. And that was intriguing to me, and I loved it, and it has very much influenced me, which you will hear in the featured song. Next chapter, 1977, England's Screaming. Punk's rules and codes would have held it back if not for people breaking them, because punk was supposed to be a breaking of the codes of society, and then it created its own rules that you, quote-unquote, had to follow. But then the New Romantics came along and said, no, you don't. You can be more fashionable, you can add electronics, etc., which itself is a punk thing to do. That's why I say New Romantic music has a punk aesthetic. That's also why I am thinking, or have called Rex music electro studio punk, or just studio punk, because my approach is very DIY, even though not everything I do sounds like punk. There seems to have been a divide between punks who preferred to be seen and make an impression as someone different, regardless of the music and whether they did, and those who didn't give a shit about the optics as long as they could do the music their way. Honestly, I feel like it's still like that in many ways, and I'm probably 85 to 15 the latter. I'm like 85% the latter, where I don't give a shit about the optics as much as maybe I should. I'm more interested in doing the music in that kind of a DIY way, and there are always going to be people who are more presentational and performative in their attitude and don't necessarily care as much about what happens in the music. But nobody is purely one or the other, no matter what they or I say. It's truth that as interesting as the anecdotal history can be, and it's very interesting, it didn't really spark for me until it started coming from musicians I actually knew, and musicians talking about the music itself. Because, listen, the fashion and the politics, it's good for context, and it's good to understand the entire world and scene of New Romantics and of the time, but it's really the music that I came to the book for. For example, Alison Moyet from her solo career and from Yaz or Yazoo, when she started talking, I was like, oh, okay, I'm perking up, because more often than not, although she does talk about gender politics, etc., she talks about the music. And so many of the musicians quoted in this book, they talked about everything, but when they got into the music, that's when I got into the book. We forget with hindsight and distance that the evolution of this music wasn't without conflict. We're used to punk energy and electronic sounds going together now, but those factions often hated each other's music. Then, that's that whole idea of factionalizing music in society, as like I talked about. And of course, as fans, there was still very much the mentality that if you liked one thing, you couldn't like another. Yeah, true. Which brings me to the next chapter. And by the way, as you have noticed, these chapters are the year and then a descriptive phrase or word. And so this one, 1978, transition. Part of the quote from Ralph Hütter, lead singer and co-founder of Kraftwerk, we should use the tools of today's society to create music. Otherwise, it is just antique. I can't agree more with that. I can't agree more with that. Go ahead and I want to be the guy that finds vintage instruments and only records on analog, whatever. Do that, okay. But do something different with it too. Bring some cultural, today context into the music, or it's just antique. You're just doing retro music. And he was referring to electronics, synths and such, but the same can be said for all styles and facets. If everything you do is a point of origin in past eras, you're not creating music for today, you're not moving the ball forward. Have at least one element that's current. Peter York, quote from Peter York, look him up. People I talked to in New York seemed to think the new romantic style came out of nowhere. They'd bought the idea of a lot of kids done up like old movie stills, which was one of the fashion things, was like 1920s, 30s. They thought these kids represented a reaction against the noisy, violent, nihilistic underclass punks they'd been hearing about. Well, not only was this untrue, but by the time it came out, it was out of date as well. The truth was, it was the same people all along. The first punks became the new romantics. Great quote. Good context. It was essentially a less conservative version of punk. And yes, in many ways, punk became conservative and can still be. It was less governed by punk's strict rules. Just like grunge, and I said this before, and I think it's worth saying again, punk was eventually co-opted by bros, skinheads and yobs in this case. Conservative, white dudes in Britain. Interesting that the U.S. version of skinheads quickly aligned with white supremacy, yay U.S., while the U.K. version was more about boneheadedness, though both crossed in both countries. You had some non-white supremacist boneheads. I also knew some pretty progressive skinheads back then. But skinheads are more closely associated now with conservatism, white supremacy, and all of that. And that is a fair assessment because the majority are that, especially today. Anyway, what I remember from back then is that more than anything, the skinheads were anarchists. And you had that big, A crossed out or whatever, the anarchy symbol. Somebody actually spray painted on the parking lot of our local Kmart, which is gone now. Both of those things are gone. And I might have just missed the racism at the time. I think I was more into the fact that it was anti-establishment. I don't know. It's incredible to me how many people, how many musicians, how many critics hated The Clash. People from all sides. And honestly, I think it's because they couldn't be classified and didn't stick to a lane. We kind of, artists like that have trouble finding their people. Again, it's annoying that I had to keep looking up things and people, but at the same time, it gave me a chance to explore and learn about, things. So this whole first-person account, it provided no context or explanation. And even at the end, I'll address it later on, there's some, but you'll hear what I mean when I get to the end of the book. I love that Neil Tennant of Pet Shop Boys says, quote unquote, that authenticity is a style. God damn, I have said that so often. I did an entire 4-part series years ago, season 2 or 3, on illusion in music. And one of those illusions was authenticity. That if you're this heartfelt singer-songwriter with an acoustic guitar, you're more authentic than somebody who does electropop. Bullshit. You can have authenticity and inauthenticity in any kind of music. It doesn't matter how it sounds. Dylan Jones talks about Saturday Night Fever. His quote, "The whole thing was based on a lie. Cohn, the writer of the article, had moved to New York as the 70s began, abandoning his journalistic career in London, and started to write a column for New York magazine called Low Outside. In one of his first pieces, he focused on a nightclub in the New York suburb, he says, which it's not a suburb, of course, it's a neighborhood of Bay Ridge, called Odyssey 2001, where disco had firmly taken root. Tribal Rights of the New Saturday Night," the article published in 1976, was such an evocative piece that it was immediately optioned by film producer Robert Stigwood, who, along with Paramount Pictures, turned it into an urban safari of immense proportions. But the remarkable thing was that Cohn had made the whole thing up. Unable to infiltrate Odyssey's tightly knit groups of disco disciples, believing that, quote, nasty pieces of work age 19 are the same in any country, any generation, unquote, and that was Cohn's quote, he decided to base his characters on the mods he had known in London's Shepherd's Bush 10 years previously. Astonishingly, no one noticed. So the whole premise of Saturday Night Fever is based on this guy's memories of something that happened 10 years earlier in Britain. Fun. Watch the movie again. See if you catch any of that. I haven't done that, by the way. It's only astonishing if you're British, honestly. His point stands, though, that it created a myth. The author talks about the Ralph West residence, and once again, his prose is heartfelt, compelling, and just damn good. Again, I kind of wish he wrote more of this book than had the people quoting, but both worked. Eventually, both worked. Self-expression through adversity, rejecting the establishment by dressing in ways antithetical to current fashion, finding yourself through character play. This is all a continuation of the punk mindset that created New Romantics and in many ways created the modern world. Nick Rhodes from Duran Duran, quote, "When I was asked to DJ at the Rum Runner in Birmingham, I basically just played all my David Bowie records. This was in 1978, and we were just about to form Duran Duran, and all of us loved Bowie. Most of the other members of the band were working at the club in some capacity, cooking, cleaning, washing up, but I actually got to play Bowie's records. Duran Duran had a single vision of what we wanted to do. We wanted to mix glam rock and punk rock with a little bit of disco. Although the prime motivation for forming in the first place was David Bowie. It always was. An entire generation of groups who formed in the late 70s or early 80s only happened because of David. He basically is responsible for British music in the first half of the 80s. There was a decadence about him that was appealing, something dark, something German, but something very exciting." That was Nick Rhodes. And then the author, talking about what was going on in 1978 in the U.S., Devo, B-52s, Blondie, Talking Heads, all these American bands. His take is that they sounded new and fresh because they were acknowledging the quote-unquote beat, a.k.a. the blackness in music all around them. This is from the author. It got me thinking rock music was born from African-American music and got whitened and died a bit with the Pat Boones, etc. It took 60s artists bringing back more of the black influence to revitalize it. Got whitened again in the 70s with some Southern rock and easy listening and prog and even punk. And it took later artists, like the artists from this book, to bring back the black influence again, thus revitalizing what had gotten stodgy. In many ways, and then hip-hop did it, and on and on and on. And then house did it, and on and on and on. In many ways, grunge was the only commercially and artistically successful whitening of rock music. And most of it was quite white, not all of it. But that too got stodgy, and it took yet again influences like hip-hop and funk to pull it out. Shame in the mid to late 2000s, etc. Do you see the pattern? Music getting homogenized and needing to be revitalized. And when the revitalization happens, we look to minority influences, let's say. There's a lesson to be learned there. I don't know what it is. It's impossible to overstate the influence of Kraftwerk on all music that eventually came. Electronic music is punk because it's equally DIY and equally lo-fi. And you need not know a whole lot about music to do it. That's what makes it punk. 3 seminal songs mentioned here: Being Boiled by the Human League, Don't You Want Me Baby, experimental electro containing all the seeds of their later pop work, but very experimental, electronics, rhythm, melody, Warm Leatherette by a band called The Normals, so arch, spoken word, warm leatherette. Sprockets, it's like Sprockets, yeah, easy to hear as cliche now, but it was revolutionary then. And then OMD's early cut, Electricity, great song, and the most accessible of these 3. Listen to them to hear the bridge between Kraftwerk and New Romantic. Andy McCluskey from OMD said, Kraftwerk taught people you could do beautiful melodic music with intellectual lyrics. Yes to art pop. That is art pop. Unlike some music movements whose blending of music with fashion, nightlife, art, dance, writing, photography, and other parts of the culture was an afterthought or an accident or not cared about, the New Romantic movement seemed to want to curate all aspects of its world, kind of like hip-hop. The upside is how it changed culture. The downside is how it made people way too style conscious. While grunge was a bit of a corrective, if itself kind of facetious, in the end, it didn't last long enough to take hold. Thankfully, things today are more of a mix, though in entertainment, still skewing too much towards style. And so I think this might be a time to take a break, even though I hadn't necessarily intended to do that, because it looks like this is going to be a bit of a longer episode, and that's okay. So let's go to the mid-roll, and I will be back in a minute. Hey, thanks for checking out this episode of Music is Not a Genre. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast, if you'd like to learn more about the music I do with my band Rec or any other projects or anything else about me, go to nickdimatteo.com. That's Nick, dammit.com, and everything is there. There's even a link to a merch store where you can get t-shirts and mugs and hats and totes and notebooks and so many other things. I'm always adding new products there. Great way to support the podcast. And finally, go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre if you'd really like to show your support. My fans and lovely family there get exclusives and other perks and early releases, and they get to suggest topics for future podcasts as well. Thanks for listening to the mid-roll. Now back to the show. All right, we are back, and usually I have something pithy to say after the mid-roll, but this is a lot, so let's get back into it. Next chapter is 1979, The Blitz. There's lots of talk about bars and scenes and club nights and hangouts. The Blitz and Steve Strange, they were vital to forming a scene where people could work together and new music could grow and thrive. I'm sure there are scenes around the world, but I can tell you from trying to find my people, flesh out my band, that in New York City, there's no scene. There hasn't been for a while. And even when there was, they were very cloistered. They wouldn't, I don't like, the vibe. It's artists doing whatever by themselves and randomly bumping into each other and moving on, and you hope that you find somebody to work with. If you are someone who wants to get into music and perform and even make a little money at originals, don't come to New York. Don't do it. Honestly, the last time New York had a proper scene was probably a decade ago, and probably more like 20 years ago, except for hip-hop. Hip-hop is the exception here. There's still quite a scene here. 1979 was a time of hard economics and conservative politics. A lot of rundown areas of the city that artists could afford to populate. We have the hard economics and conservative politics, and we do not have enough rundown areas for people without a lot of money to populate. Nothing's affordable. Apparently, a very young and poor Boy George was quite a fashion leader in the late 70s. There's a real obsession, again, with the 30s and 40s and 20s, which explains putting on the Ritz and Goody Two-Shoes, finally. This was pre-AIDS, by the way, and this community was eventually decimated. Art school played a huge part in this era, as it did in the 60s. Like all higher education, it is now way more expensive and inclusive. So, we still get art school bands. I don't know if I think Wombats came out of an art school. So it's one of the reasons I'm wearing this shirt, also because they're a British band, and they have definitely been influenced by New Romantic. Karen Woodward from Bananarama was part of the scene. British politics, parallels to American, Thatcher, Reagan, anti-union, reversing social support policies. New Romanticism was escapism as much as expression. Sci-fi, re-synths, and fashion and performance. Can't forget how important Trevor Horn was. Can't forget. Kind of like the Phil Spector of his day, but not insane. And I'm going to do, when I do my series on the great producers of each decade, I will definitely be mentioning Trevor Horn. Quote from the author, "The New Romantics were fluid. Any group that includes women and gay men is far more likely to be peaceful and inclusive." That's my quote. For a while, though, the scene had very few people of color. That did change. I learned a new word, vopping, which means doing a variety of projects. So for my whole life, but especially the last 7-8 years, I've been vopping. V-O-P-P-I-N-G. Look it up. And again, Spandau Ballet, quite pivotal. They called what they did white European dance music, one of the most successful bands in that era. They took New Romantic into a pop mainstream direction. And that's what the bonus MXtra is about. Patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. Spandau Ballet. You'll be surprised what you discover. Please think about joining me at Patreon. It helps support everything. Neil Tennant. Again, quote from Pet Shop Boys, and he was a journalist before he started them. "The whole renaissance of British pop starts with Gary Newman and his song Our Friends Electric." Our Friends Electric. He took the David Bowie thing and reduced it to a black t-shirt and a pair of black jeans. That was Neil Tennant. Another example of how different USA and UK cultures were. Gary Newman was huge in the UK, but only here he did Cars, and that's about all we know. And number one hit, stuff like that. Apparently has Asperger's. Interesting fella. Punk eschewed keyboards because it was associated with prog, but synth pop New Romantic recontextualized them for people who couldn't play as well as frickin' Keith Emerson, I guess. Grunge didn't like synths either. In the late 90s, backlash to that was severe, and I was happy to see it, even though I like both. Bowie. This is, quote, experimentation can be rewarding for finding the awkward stances musically, but it just isn't satisfying after a while. And it's not satisfying because it's not very useful, except, as Brian Eno would say, for setting up a new kind of vocabulary. I couldn't agree more. Experiment all you want. Put some of it out if you want. Put out everything you do. But don't think that your random experiment of something you knew you discovered is actually going to be a good song or a listenable song. It is an exploration, and not all explorations are meant to be shared. Okay. John Fox from Ultravox. Metamatic was the first synth album of the 1980s. No, Metamatic. John Fox was from Ultravox and Metamatic, I guess. First synth album of the 1980s was Underpass. Look up Underpass. Metamatic. 1980, next chapter, The Charms, Such as They Were. This point made that new romantic people weren't as drugged out as punks. I mean, late 90s vis-a-vis the early 90s, very similar. Could it be said that certain types of music attract people more inclined to hard drugs? And yet eventually, some of both scenes would succumb to drug use anyway. New romantic wanted to claim glamour as something other than for the rich. Adam Ant wanted to be much more successful than he was when he was a punk with his band, so he enlisted Malcolm McLaren to help. They formed a band. Malcolm McLaren wasn't impressed with how it was gelling, so he stole the musicians from Adam Ant's band and created Bow Wow Wow. Yes, Adam Ant embodied the shift from black and white to color, from punk to new romantic, post-punk to new romantic, from obscure to pop. He loved Roxy Music and Brian Ferry, again, and Bowie. Duran Duran and Depeche Mode were a distillation of everything that came before. They were like second wave, each with a different balance of rock and electronic. They were the fulfilled promise. They gave a direction for earlier bands to follow. And those bands subsequently became more accessible. Human League, OMD, came before Duran Duran and Depeche Mode, but then listened to them and said, oh, we can be pop and still kind of interesting and cool? Yes. Duran Duran's sound came quite a bit from Roxy Music's Flesh and Blood, and man, when you listen to that, this is the song Same Old Scene from Flesh and Blood, you will absolutely agree it sounds like Duran Duran. Of course, the band Japan from Britain was what Duran Duran modeled a lot of their sound on too. Fashion magazine upstarts in this year were the zines for New Romantic in Britain, The Face, ID, and Blitz. ID was punk in its approach and appearance, and though it covered all things, it focused more than anything on pop culture and pop music. Punk and pop mixed together, which became New Romantic. They were kind of the internet forums of their day. 1981, Video Killed the Radio Star. It's a song I'm doing with my 80s band for a big show we have in November. I'm not singing the lead, but I will be on it. Can't underestimate the power of MTV or the need for an artist's visual aesthetics to be more developed than ever. Two things. First, artists have always been conscious of their image, but it was rarely considered to be a barrier to entry if an artist wasn't fully on point. You could be slightly off and be okay. That changed. Part of MTV's rapid success story was due to its rise coinciding with the New Romantic movement, which prized visuals and fashion more consistently and cohesively than any other genre before it, if not any other prior artist. It's possible this movement made it not just more necessary for artists to align their look with their genre, but also pushed other genres like hair metal and hip-hop to align more rigidly to a set of style guides. It was kind of the template for other types of music. Even grunge, narrow band of fashion acceptability. Depeche Mode were written off after Vince Clarke left to form Yazoo and eventually Erasure, also because synth pop was starting to be considered as a flash in the pan. But they stuck to it and triumphed and changed the face of music. So often something that's thought of as a fad and written off, such as rock and roll, disco and dance music, hip-hop, electronic music, some years later comes back so strong, conquers the music world. And all of those did at some point. Mark Ellen was the editor of Smash Hits. He made a great point. The 80s music revolution was that sound was freed from all its traditional shackles and the studio became the instrument. I just took that for granted, but that's where it really came from. Toya Wilcox said, I always think of the 80s as the alien tearing itself out of the body of punk. What a great quote. Don't know who that is. Neo-naturist. Punk had strictures. New Romantic had opposite ones. These people, neo-naturists, rebelled against both. Very feminist movement. The Specials and Two-Tone were precursors to trip-hop and other dark ambient music. That band and the style, much bigger in the UK than the US. A lot of riots in 81. Financial and political changes in Britain were ahead of those in the U.S. and were causing riots because of things like deregulation, rolling back of the social safety net, high unemployment, huge rift between left and right, increased racism and street violence, stop and search, police brutality, looting. Does any of this ring a bell? Second time I've been made aware that Spandau Ballet were way more popular and influential in the UK. Chant number 1, their song is now on my playlist, is Nothing Like True. Look up Chant number 1 and check out the bonus MxG at patreon.com/music is not a genre for a deep dive on Spandau Ballet. Grace Jones should be more known to this day. Revolutionary, and I think she's going to have a renaissance soon. There's a photo section in the middle of the book. In the middle of that chapter of 1981, there's both black and white and color spanning the 75 to 85 decade. Small, but nice collection. 1982, next chapter, Wake Me Up Before You, Whiskey A Go-Go. Neil Tennant, again, learned, he was a critic before he co-founded Pet Shop Boys, basically on a dare, self-dare as well. Duran Duran was often reviled, partly because they were more successful or too pop. Acts who think they're being rebellious by writing more obscure music often look down at those who try to write solid songs. 90% of the latter wins history. Solid songs will win over obscure music any day, even the obscure music that's been influential. People like Paul Morley are why critics are hated. Pompous ass, more interested in his own turns of phrase and creating false context to justify his opinions than anything to do with the actual music. Screw you, Paul Morley. The New Romantic movement was fracturing in 82. Some of the earlier bands hung on. It was the second wave of bands, though, who really hit. Wham!, Bananarama, Duran Duran. And this is when things largely started to hit the States because of MTV. Quotes from George Michael made me realize it would have been nice if the author had pinpointed when the quotes were from. It's clear some of them were contemporaneous or close to it. Some were today, like the when he wrote the book in 2020, so 2019, 2018, and some were who knows when. You know, and the context would have helped because the way a person said something, you weren't sure what time of their life and career they were in. 1982, the fashion was shifting to more blue collar, torn jeans, bleached hair, to reflect both the plight of the working class and the connection to hip-hop. The WAG Club, previously known as the Whiskey A Go-Go, WAG, which by then had fallen on blah times, had been overtaken by Roxy Roadshow, which is credited as having introduced hip-hop to the UK. Biggest songs of influence that year in the UK were Grandmaster Flash's The Message and The Adventures of Grandmaster Flash and the Wheels of Steel. Also, Last Night a DJ Saved My Life by In Deep. I love that song. And Planet Rock by Africa Bambaataa. I love all those songs, really. This was all an extension of the Northern Soul, rare soul craze in the 1970s, means clubs dedicated to playing black music in defiance of the clubs that wouldn't allow it or wouldn't allow black people themselves. This was often mixed with electro and electro-funk, so you can see how the next wave of UK music absorbed and interpreted all of this together. Black music was often segregated, I think, possibly because there was an unspoken respect for it that caused intimidation and fear because the racists who silently respected it felt they couldn't measure up. I also think that's true about, latent homosexual conservatives. Japan is a band so many people talked about. Duran Duran influence. The author says they moved through our lives without leaving much of a trace. A ghost ship, the Flying Dutchman of modern British pop. It's like how people say Hanoi Rocks was the first hair metal band, but I never heard a song of theirs until like this year. Too proto. And they didn't, have the commercial success. And Japan didn't like being associated with the New Romantics. They had a sound. They had a style. I love their sound. I love their style and their look, Japan. But the songs weren't as strong as the Duran Duran songs. And I will actually, I think, do an episode this year about proto music and how it's important as an influence, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's as good as the stuff that came after. 1982 is when Japan quit. Ubiquity of British synth duos, Blancmange, Tears for Fears, Yaz, Erasure, OMD, The Buggles, Soft Cell, Pet Shop Boys, Eurythmics, and The Associates. I know most of those, but not all. Huge point, huge precursor to modern music. At the time, it was frowned on to make music in this artificial, quote-unquote, way. Only two people in electronics. Even if you weren't a full band, you'd at least hire session musicians and not DIY it. Boy, has that changed, thankfully. 1983, next chapter, the cradle of choruses. Like all subcultures, post-punk and new wave eventually became mainstream, at least for a while. Many of the bands ditched the synth aesthetic and moved more toward legit instrumentation. And that, to me, is when the early 80s sweet spot for me became the big hair, over-reverbed 80s. And 83 was kind of the pivotal year. And by 84, I think it was all big. And 85, forget it. In some ways, 84 was pivotal, too. The good that came of this were bands like Culture Club, Tears for Fears, Depeche Mode, New Order, Wham, Duran Duran, the Eurythmics. Out of those, the biggest out of the gate were Culture Club and Duran Duran. The Duran Duran took a little slower to boil, but they blew up. And eventually Wham and New Order. Tears for Fears and Depeche and Eurythmics would soon follow. And though Spandau and Frankie Frankie Goes to Hollywood, that is, made a minimal splash here, they were nearly equal huge phenoms in the UK. So Frankie Goes to Hollywood was almost as big as Spandau Ballet. Again, what? Bonus M Extra. Patreon.com/music is not a genre to hear all about Spandau Ballet. Japan the country played a huge role in this, as of course it did America as well. One of the few, if only, times that British music was more rabidly loved in other countries than in Britain by this point. Neil Tennant said, one of the good things about punk was the way in which it suddenly edits the pop song back to 2.5, 3 minutes. It brings back the songwriting discipline that develops into power pop. Then you add in elements of the avant-garde and politics and style, and then finally electronics. And so you have a renaissance of British pop that lasts until 1985. The new romantic scene takes the lessons of punk with well-crafted pop songs, but now they're looking for glamour. Great quote. Malcolm McLaren came back, never went away this period, with the song Buffalo Gals. Scratching in that song, made famous. Trevor Horn produced it. Electronic music was dominating. MTV was at a peak. Midge from Ultravox, I believe it was a heady period. But you've got to remember that while you might try and say all the bands were part of the new romantic scene, they were all wildly different. This is a quote from him, by the way. Culture Club were radically different from Duran Duran, who were different from Spandau. Spandau were soul boys. Duran were a bit of whatever, and Culture Club were playing soft reggae. They all had a look. They all had a style. What they all had in common was the ability to experiment in an environment that allowed them to be creative. The big thing was the video revolution. We were making videos before there was a vehicle on which to show them in America. So when MTV started, the only content they had was from the UK. Great quote. It was a time when DIY was in full effect. This is me talking. Everyone young was giving it a go somehow, and labels were eating it up. It might explain why Ricky Gervais had brief success with his band Siona Dancing. There was a sound and aesthetic that went from indie to pop, and anyone who tried it was at least given a shot. Reminds me of 10 years after that with grunge, or 10 years before that with disco. And all of them went over the top and fizzled out. Far more quickly than it took them to rise up, which is the true of anything, I think. There's a running thread that artists who pretended to be rich and posh were broke, that eventually became rich and posh and lived the life, and that said that greed was good. Pop and commerce merged and became big business. And ironically, or not, this is when Britain's economy was shit. Most people were barely living in income inequality. Pop music provided a dream and an escape, but also a painful contrast and unrealistic aspiration. Sound familiar? Second British invasion was peaking in this year. July 16th, 1983, there were 18 top 40 singles were British, topping the previous record of 14 during the first British invasion on June 18th, 1965. Which brings us to 1984. The Pleasure Dome. It's the name of this chapter. Chapter title references Frankie Goes to Hollywood's Welcome to the Pleasure Dome album and the 16-minute title track. True nature of the 1980s slammed hard. Pop, as it was, became an even bigger business. Everything became business. Artists, with and without grounding, lost their way. The former, with grounding, would bounce back. The latter would disappear or worse. Racism and classism were rampant in and out of the music biz. And with fans, it seemed those were even stronger in the UK at this time, oddly. Sade had an easier time getting accepted in the United States, and by this year were huge, partly because Quiet Storm programming had started in the 70s by a DJ named Melvin Lindsay, and was named after Smokey's 1975 album, and by the 80s was big and easy to find on the radio. That hasn't changed much. And this is the second time I've heard from Brits that the U.S. music fans and business were more open and accepting and less into the politics of music and musicians. I agree that we were less into the politics of music and musicians. I can't believe that they think that we're more open and accepting. I tend to think that Britain is. So maybe it's grass is greener kind of thing. The 80s were an overcorrection of the 70s. I'm going to do an episode about everything is an overcorrection of everything else or something like that. 70s were meant to be echoes of hippie shabby. The 80s were way too consumed with fashion and codifying which clothes it was okay to wear, depending on what subgroup you were a part of. Breakfast Club was real. Music production had crossed over into the big 80s sound, a wash-in reverb and drum machines and trebly synths. The one upside, dance was king. Everything had a beat. Iconic discos in the 70s, packed. They were paled in comparison to how many dance clubs there were in the 80s. Dance clubs in the 80s were huge, as I believe the 90s. We went dancing all the time. It was as valid and common a choice. Hey, you want to go to a bar? You want to go to a dance club? You want to go to a restaurant? You're going to a pool party? You want to go to a skating rink? These were all pretty equal. Working Week was a jazz dance band, kind of like proto-acid jazz. Proto-soul to soul, jazzy, funky, dancing. Never heard of Working Week. A comment here on Buffalo stance. Buffalo, Nana Cherry, Buffalo was an attitude, a way of living. It stands for rebellious self-expression, friendship, and a fearless creative spirit. It was about celebrating who you were and having a laugh. Buffalo clashed culture and gender stereotypes. Tough mixed-race boys in skirts and a pair of DM boots. Utility sportswear, DM Doc Martin, mixed with high fashion, casting girls as boys, kids as men, breaking down boundaries, creating iconic images. Her song Buffalo Stance was a tribute to the Buffalo Crew, the movement. What they did in fashion, we did in music. A lot of updates in politics here, as the book has a lot of that. Wham! Had a big 1984. Trevor Horn, again. Frankie Goes to Hollywood was huge in 1984. All three of their singles first singles went to number one in the UK. They were apparently the first to think of every aspect of the career all at once. Music, image, T-shirts, performance videos, merch, all of that, personality, and really set the template for every artist after, for better or worse. I say worse, but that's the world. Paul Morley, you heard me talk about him. It was an unexpected combination of energies. You had a truly great producer, the best in the world, along with Quincy Jones. You had a slightly narcissistic journalist. You had this heterosexual Scouse energy and this very exploratory gay energy all mixed up in one place. It was a ridiculous formula, and you couldn't have planned it. It was too toxic. So I don't like his spin, but I understand what he was saying. They crashed and burned, Frankie, though they were at the forefront, even doing sexual controversy before Madonna, controversy. They weren't the best, again, and I'm going to do an episode on that kind of thing. Huge section on American acts that were huge at the time, which is meant to signify that the tide was turning from the British invasion back to America. Madonna, Prince, Michael Jackson, Bruce Springsteen, and a whole thing on Hall & Oates. Also the Police, which I guess were half or one-third American. Whole thing on how huge dance clubs were, as I mentioned, in the 1980s. The rest of the chapter is about the contrast between glitz and money of the 1980s and the drive for musicians to raise money for social causes. Do They Know It's Christmas was 1984. It seems like a reunion of the older and newer new romantic people, which I didn't know until I read this book. The author mentions a charity single that came out just a little before this one called Free Nelson Mandela by a guy from the Specials named Jerry Dammers. It was a decent hit and raised money, and that's what gave him the idea to do, Do They Know It's Christmas, Band-Aid, and then eventually Live Aid. All right. 1985, like punk, never happened. Band-Aid became Live Aid. Wembley and JFK in Philly. Those are the two spots. And there were others, I believe, in the world which were not televised. Brits, including the author, will say that London is synonymous with this, and Americans would say, Philly is. Of course, there were also concerts in Sydney, Cologne, Moscow, and Holland. Let's not forget that Bob Geldof was a Boomtown Rats musician with some influence, but no money, and somehow he did all this. Pays to know people. I didn't know that I Don't Like Mondays, their song, was about a mass shooting. Listen to it again. Time and eras are as deceptive as genres. This was both the culmination of 1960s peace and love and the me decade. Money and greed all at once in the 80s. But after all, it's like both sides came together and then, of course, fought again, It was also the kickoff for far more musicians being involved in charity and social causes. Van Zandt, Stevie Van Zandt, Bono, Michael Jackson, Lionel Richie. Kicked off stadium tours and festivals, actually, as well. Status Quo is a hugely successful Brit band. Started in the 1960s, still around. They more consistently released albums from 68 to 2019 than any other non-solo artist I can think of. They had over 60 chart hits in the UK, more than any other act, and I never, until this book, heard of Status Quo. Makes me wonder if I should do an episode on huge acts, other parts of the world that we've never heard of. Big stretch of writing, catching up the reader on history again, politics, to technology, soda, sports, fashion, camel case, the writing where you have an uppercase letter in the middle of the name, but it's all one word, like YouTube. And then we check back in with Bowie and Ferry. Grace Jones says, there is some 80s music that is just timeless. The melodies, the lyrics, I called it church. Church in a club. You can shout and dance. The best of the 80s was club church. I agree in many ways. Jim Kerr, lead singer of Simple Minds. To me, it wasn't so much any movement. It was more like there weren't 2 or 3 bands like The Cure. There was The Cure. There weren't 2 or 3 bands like The Human League, like The Birthday Party, like The Smiths. There was one of each. A lot of real individualism and wonderful imagination to such a level that it was almost overwhelming. And then there was a big discussion of AIDS and how there was still influenced by hippie optimism and punk and glam and disco and gay culture up until 1985. And then all of this just was crashing and burning. Big year for Madonna, Whitney Houston. It was the peak of British invasion, after which there was a decline. It was the rise of hair metal and the PMRC and Tipper Gore. Ew. I'm going to skip that. I feel like this was an indication Rough and Ready origins were transitioning to the moneyed elite, and clubs like the Groucho Club, look it up, exemplified that. I guess that's inevitable. Steve Dagger said, possibly one of the reasons the period has been demonized is because it did not stay in the avant-garde for very long. It became overground very, very quickly. The longer things stay in the underground, the longer they can be mythologized. Of course, all this coexisted with increasing economic inequality and political unrest. All commentators in the book agree that there was a qualitative difference between the early and late 1980s, and the transition is 1985. And I think 84, 85. What started as the ironic decadence of punk became filtered through new romantic, became unironic maximalism, which people remember more than the innovative, sublime earlier 80s. And I think that's what did in a lot of the bands, trying to lay into the maximalism when they came from a minimalistic aesthetic. It just wasn't natural to them. Plus, they took the ironic hunger for luxury too seriously. And then, of course, drugs and AIDS were tough in that culture too. Bowie and Roxy and Kraftwerk and German electronic in general, and how Japan, the band, A European Sun, look up that song. They were all ahead of the curve. Michelle Clapton says the period still looked at as a time of change, questioning what was deemed beautiful, strange, acceptable. I think it was the catalyst for the more open views of most of society today, which I hope continues, although right now I have worrying doubts. Good quote. Interesting people quoted in this book also say that the economic struggles of the 1980s, which were big, still are nowhere near as bad as they are today. Sade gets a lot of credit in this book, and in fact, the afterword, which is called Marchioness de Sade. A whole chapter dedicated just to Sade. They were related to the soul contingent of the new romantic movement, but were also outliers. But they were also part of it because punk was their aesthetic, and they were their cohorts as well. You can look up Sade. I may do an episode on Sade. Andrew Hale, with hindsight, you realize there was so much music that was an influence. We were listening to early hip-hop and electro coming out of New York, like Schoolie D and Mantronics. I love those two, which had a rawness, and Schoolie D's from Philly, a similar energy to punk. Alongside that, I was obsessed by Talking Heads and Yellow Magic Orchestra. Look up my video game music episode for them. And Steely Dan. Look up my Steely Dan episode for them. So it's coming from all over. It was a combination of feeling that you could try anything, but you had a respect for musicianship and dogged perseverance at the same time. Lots of variety and evolution in okay, never mind. I'm gonna skip that. Don't forget that I said anything about that. But I will say that this last afterword on Sade makes me want to listen to all of their music. Next section, Dramatis Personae. So this is a section I wish was at the top. It lists all the people who were talking in the book. All right. Either way, I'm glad it's here. And it's kind of fun because there's little quips and stuff like that. And it helped me summarize, I think, the most important people in the book and in this era in general, before, during, or after, were Sade, Bowie, Boy George, Steve Dagger, Fiona Dealey, Roxy Music, Brian Ferry, Kraftwerk, Depeche Mode, Trevor Horn, Duran Duran, Malcolm McLaren, George Michael, New Order, and Joy Division, The Eurythmics, Neil Tennant, Vivienne Westwood, as well as the journalists who mythologized and immortalized the music of the people in the scene, including the photographers. Side note, Hall & Oates were apparently the most popular act of the 1980s, according to the U.S. charts. Their songs spent the most time on the 80s charts more than any other artist in the U.S. at 246 weeks. Let's hear it for Philly artists. In that last section, I believe, discography. They don't make the future like they used to. Dylan Jones, he attempted to list the important records of the time that fit the narrative and the arc of the story. There are a lot of great music you won't find, songs and albums you won't find here because they didn't fit the narrative, but look them up is basically what he's saying. The selection is not only a great list that could easily be a great playlist, but each song is placed in context via year and a brief description, and it's witty, like all of the author's writing. Funny that his editorializing on which songs and albums he likes and doesn't is proof that we don't have the same taste. But he does include a lot of things that he doesn't like because he's, wants to be accurate. The acknowledgments section usually don't care, but the first part of this section, the first 2 pages, really well written and fun. There are 154 contributors in this book if you include the author. The interviews here that were contemporaneous to the writing were conducted in 2018 and 2019. But again, I wish for all the other ones there was a date on when those quotes happened because clearly Bowie wasn't interviewed then, etc. Conclusions, and these are mine. So that's the book. Despite my reservations and objections, eventually I grew to love the book. Very measured pace, and it really put you into the world. You really did. Running through lines, fashion, rebellion that becomes the norm over and over, aspirational people who become what they pretend to be, the look, the politics, economics, Malcolm McLaren, dancing, and the music. One of the biggest impressions is how insular a country's political, social, and musical experiences are. We globalists think of the world as more interconnected than not, and maybe that's true more now than ever, but even now, we're all very insular. We don't understand another country's experience unless we've lived there, and even then, don't quite know it. 2 things. That cough was free. Number 1, I mentioned a few times how things like sexual freedom and economic and political changes seem like they're parallel, and these things do generally spread in similar ways through any country that isn't a bubble dictatorship. Number 2, though, people like me who have broad tastes like to think of music as circulating fairly readily and often equally, but that's only true for artists like U2 and Coldplay and Tears for Fears. Most music is still, to this day, very country-specific, which is why I was blown away often about bands like Spandau Ballet or Status Quo or Working Week and bands I'd never, ever heard of. And that's why I'm psyched to focus on the bonus MxG. Patreon.com/music is not a genre is on Spandau Ballet. We're going to go far beyond their hit True and get into the truth of Spandau Ballet and how freaking huge they were. Patreon.com/music is not a genre. 2 final words. If you have any interest at all in the music of Britain from 75 to 85 and the culture, this book is for you. And number 2, I understand more than ever that I love contrast, which is the first law of art, from a quote that I once read in an old piano book when I was a kid. You can say I like new wave because that's when I grew up, but that's not the only thing. I think it's because it has built-in contrast, punk energy and two-tone energy, real world, DIY, but yet it was diverse and dreamy and electronic and mannered in a lot of ways. It was both grounded and soaring. Like how I like to do my music. Speaking of my music, the featured song, I could have picked dozens of songs that got their influence from new wave, new romantic. And I think when people say part of what Rec does reminds them of the 1980s, it's not the sound, it's the new romantic aesthetic, new wave aesthetic, the mix of rock and electro and pop. It's the electro studio punk. That said, considering the general theme of this book, I'm choosing Any Universe from Rec's album, The Sunshine Seminar, and also from RECcollection, The Best of Rec 2007 to 2020. And yes, it's a song I've chose before for a podfast. This is an electro rock dance song, very atmospheric, layered synths, and it hits hard with the guitars. The vocals both intimate and powerfully keening. It's in a minor key because the lyrics deal with the urgency of feeling like you want to hold on to an intense love no matter where or when in any universe. Lots of astrophysics referenced here, both real and speculative. I love that kind of weaving of love and science, rock and electro. And I think it's a perfect pick for this episode. Click the link and listen to it wherever you stream music. And also stay tuned for in the next minute, you're going to hear it. Questions. Have you read this book? How familiar are you with the music history spanning 1975 to 85, especially in the UK? What artists from that era, if any, are your favorites? Were you aware how different the UK fan experience is from the US fans and really still is to this day? I'd love to know all the answers to these questions because, as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for hanging with me for this packed episode. Go read the book, go listen to the music, stay tuned for the featured song, and I will talk to you next week.
Your home with a retracting dome so you could see the sky is ours whenever. The universe, a cathedral of words, your whisper warm and soft and